Serious. What's the scariest true story you have ever heard or are able to tell? Part 2. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. I met a guy who had been traveling Australia with a couple friends, hitchhiking around as many of us had done. One of his friends told him they were near this distant uncle's house, whom he'd never met before. He got a phone number from a family member, and as they had hoped, the uncle offered them a place to stay. He picked them up in town and drove them out to his rural property way out in the bush. They said he seemed like a pretty normal guy, friendly and cheery. When it was time to set up a place to sleep, the uncle took them to a closet that was totally full of sleeping bags and bedrolls. They didn't think much of it at the time and all grabbed a kit and set up on the living room floor. They stayed a couple of days and nothing out of the ordinary happened, and afterwards the uncle drove them to the bus station and they continued on their way. About a year later, that man was arrested and charged with several counts of murder. He was the man who was picking up young hitchhiking backpackers and slaughtering them. The guy who told me the story was 100% certain he had slept in the sleeping bag of one of his victims. There is a freak story that never leaves me. A guy went missing in 2004. He had left home without shoes or jacket in October, and just before he disappeared, he had called his friends and asked if they wanted to come and go to a sauna with him, like a normal Finnish person might do on a Friday night. His girlfriend came from work to an empty house, home with lights on and the front door open. Case went cold and the guy was not found. 4 years later, kids were playing in the woods near the missing guy's home and noticed a scarecrow high in a spruce tree. They told their parents, who came to investigate and immediately called the police. It was not a scarecrow. It was the body of the guy who went missing 4 years before. He was tied to the tree, and the body had been there for the whole time the guy was missing. It was officially ruled as a suicide. Now, the weird thing is that according to people on some Finnish crime websites, the rope wasn't tied to his neck, like it would be if he tried to hang himself and got stuck in a tree. He sat on a branch facing the trunk, and his body was tied from 3 or 4 places to that tree. That doesn't really scream suicide to me. The guy was a drug user and had been in prison for drugs too. Some people on those websites think that his sudden disappearance and strange death might be related to drug debts. Did someone force him to climb the tree and tie himself up like that? Maybe he died of hypothermia up there, since temperatures in Finland in October can drop below 0, and the debt collectors just left the body. Another strange thing is that newspapers didn't tell where he was found or how he died, just that some kids found him near his home and there was no crime. This story is so weird. It has disturbed me ever since I heard it. In my city, there is a theme park called Dream World. There was this ride called Thunder River Rapids, and it was a flume-like ride with round gondolas, and it would simulate a storm. A few years ago, at the end of the ride, the gondolas were being transferred from the river to the conveyor belt to bring it up to the next passengers when it flipped over. The passengers were crushed up by the machinery underneath and died, the only survivor being a little girl who was picked up and thrown aside by her uncle, who seemed to know what her fate would have been in that split second before he too was crushed. Investigations proved that it was gross negligence that caused this gruesome event. They said there were 7 seconds time to press the emergency stop. Someone said he pressed it, but it didn't stop immediately. The ride had broken down a few times that day, and they still let it run. The case is still being investigated. I watched an interview with the grandma who went on holidays with them. She lost all of her family except for her granddaughter, and it was the most heartbreaking thing I ever saw. In my town in Massachusetts, it's uncommon for you to let your kids bike home after school or around the town. In 1978, a young girl named Mary Lou Arruda was kidnapped while riding her bike home one day. The man drove her past her own home while she was unable to free herself in the back of his car. She was later found tied to a tree, brutally murdered in the local state forest. The police had her killer, but because of faulty police work involving a psychic at one point, the convictions were overturned. The case shocked the town so badly that until the killer's death in 2016, anyone who was around during that time could tell you exactly who did it, where exactly it happened, and everything. The police officers, many now in their 80s, still know the exact model of tire, car, and everything about the killer. To this day, I wasn't allowed to walk home from school, and when I was young, even though my house was about 5 minutes from the school, and my relatives are adamant that you do not let your kids go biking alone. In my town, it's an annual tradition in middle school to have your fingerprints recorded, your bite mark taken, and your information, height, eye color, hair color, nationality, etc., so it's on record in case of emergencies. Was at a bonfire where people were telling ghost stories, and a friend told us this story about his aunt in Mexico. Back when she was a little kid, 6 or 7 I think, they lived on a ranch near some mountains, and one day she was out playing and ended up going missing. A lot of people from the area came to help look for her, call for her, but nothing. I think he said like a week went by, and the family had begun to give up hope. Then suddenly, she comes from out of the trees, dirty and with her mouth sewn shut. The family takes her to the hospital immediately. The story the little girl tells is that she was wandering around the trees, and some duende came out and asked her to play with them. So she goes with them in the woods, and when she starts to get hungry, they tell her she needs to stay, so she does. But then it starts to get dark, so she eventually finds her way back home. She apparently thought she was just gone for a couple of hours and not a week. But apparently after that, the girl was never the same, and she grew up to be a very quiet and reserved woman. He says she still has the scars from where the mouth was sewn shut. So, while everyone at the time was telling stories about how duende are 100% real, and some people had even seen them when visiting their families in Mexico, that's definitely scary on its own. But for this story in particular, what's scary is that this 7-year-old girl was taken from her family ranch and held hostage in the woods for a week, where she was so tortured that she ended up blocking out what happened to her and came up with a story in order to cope. And then people who took her sewed her mouth shut, probably thinking she would die before she ever made it back to her family's home. I was hitchhiking through South Australia heading west. I was about 14, and I got picked up by a carload of 20-something blokes in an old HQ. They were well effed up. At one point, one of these guys tells me that they're going to a party and do I want to come. Well, I was on walkabout, and that's all about finding yourself and new experiences, so I was like, hells yeah. But then the driver got all upset. No, he said. In his loud voice, he said, no. F you, see you next Tuesdays, not again. And he screeched the car to a stop in the middle of F off nowhere and said, get out. I'm like, what? And all these other guys are protesting, and he looks me dead in the eyes and says, get out, now. He seemed pretty serious, so I did. Every other See You Next Tuesday was losing their collective shit, and I was left standing on the side of the road, 200 clicks from effing anything. Now, I don't know what they were planning, but in retrospect, I'm fairly sure it wasn't nothing good. Still, no worries, mate. Grew up in the suburb where all the Green River killings took place. Gary Ridgway got arrested in 2001, which was when I was ending middle school and about to start high school. Everyone had some small, insignificant story about him, like him being their neighbor or seeing him around, or my uncle's coworker was one of his friends, stuff like that. Then, once I made a new best friend in high school, whose mom used to work at the Kenworth factory he worked at, she said that they would joke that Gary was the killer because he'd always be out sick the day after a murder. Then, like clockwork, a few weeks after each murder, jewelry would turn up in the women's restroom, just left out on the sink. So people would turn it into lost and found, and eventually, after no one claimed it, would keep it. Apparently, he did this to see the trophies of the jewelry from the women he killed being worn around the factory by women he knew. They only figured that out about a year after his arrest. She said she had some jewelry which she had to turn in as evidence. My old boss once nonchalantly divulged the following story at an end-of-year Christmas party. He had built a home in the Victorian countryside during the 80s. During the build, he would often drop in first thing before work to see the previous day's efforts and greet the tradesmen. He was in the process of laying the garage foundation when he was surprised to see the builders had already set up and were in the midst of pouring the foundation upon his arrival. He implied that this meant they had been working throughout the night and early morning to have it completed to this stage. A flustered builder rushed to meet him halfway down the driveway and explained that his guys were needed elsewhere during the day, hence the ridiculously early start, and that his presence wasn't necessary, so he left for work. The following months after the garage had been completed, he would often notice that a layer of brown dust would seep through the concrete, which he would need to sweep away. It eventually stopped appearing. Fast forward a year or so from his home's completion. He saw that the builder was being investigated for a semi-high-profile disappearance of a TV model who he was in a relationship with. If I recall correctly, he said she appeared on the Australian Sale of the Century. He explained that he never pursued it with authorities as he didn't want his house ripped apart in search for a body buried in the foundation. He has since sold the place. It naturally put a bit of a downer on the rest of the party, as everyone apart from him was horrified. He promptly attempted to joke the story away and change the topic once he got the impression that those of us listening didn't find the story as scandalous as he did. I've since tried to Google the story regarding a missing TV model, however, have come up with nothing. So it's hard to know how much truth there is to the story, or even if it's possible for corpse residue to seep through dried concrete. Not sure if this fully answers your question, as I can't confirm truth, but it did or does creep me out. TLDR. My old boss thinks a dead model is buried in the foundation of his house, but did nothing about it. I'm not sure if it's scary as such, but I remember my uncle telling me that when he was a young man, a guy went missing one town over. The missing man and a couple of his mates lived out of town on a series of small farms pretty close together on the coast. The locals and authorities had always been suspicious that his two friends had gotten rid of him for some reason. One of the friends ended up making the deathbed confession to his grandson. "I've done some things in my life that I'm not proud of. I once helped cook a man." And he went on to tell the story of how him and his friends had killed the missing man and cooked him over a fire in a 44-gallon drum of water and fed him to pigs. Darkness in this one. So, years and years back, on an autumn night, I experienced my first and only bad trip from magic mushrooms. I ended up locking myself in my bedroom in my flat, and at one point heard the most horrible noises, scratching, and a kind of eerily wet choke over and over, and it just never seemed to end. I was curled up in a ball, scared out of my mind at whatever this thing was trying to break through my wall. Well, it eventually stopped, but the night wasn't over for me, and stayed bad until I eventually drifted back to reality and passed out from the stress of what I had heard. Now, the real horror comes in. Those noises were not part of my trip. My upstairs neighbor, whose staircase went along my bedroom wall above a cupboard, had died that night from an overdose. He had vomited into his lungs bad enough to be lethal, but not bad enough to be fast, and he had been clawing at my wall, presumably for attention. I found out over the next few days he wasn't alone. His best friend had KO'd on the couch, and the dead guy had gone to the bathroom to be sick. It went wrong, and when staggering out, he had fallen down the stairs, leaving him badly injured and stuck at the bottom next to my wall. I don't see it as a case I could have helped in. Had I been sober enough to do anything, I would not have been home at all. But as terrifying as what I felt was, I feel what he went through was a terror most couldn't imagine, as I know I can't. Trapped, dying, and with people around, but that you can't get the attention of is a nightmare fuel at its worst. The one that used to scare me, that my mother would tell me, was about her hard, abusive mother in the 1960s. Her mom used to do witchcraft, and she told me once about a time when her mother dressed in all black and had a bunch of children from the neighborhood come over and chant with her around a small black box. Afterwards, her mother took the box and threw it in a lake. She never found out what kind of ritual her mother was trying to perform, but the thought of that sight gives me shivers. This woman hated children. She once tied her autistic son up in a tree by his wrists and left him there for hours as punishment. But another one that I heard was from my dad's friend. He was a really stoic doctor. I never really heard the man speak very much. He was always serious. One time he told us of one of the things he could never explain that happened in his life. It was when he was younger and in med school. He was in his apartment and I think was hearing noises in his living room. So he got up to look around and grabbed a knife from the kitchen. He didn't find anything, so he went back into his bedroom and was greeted by the size of his twin bed spring mattress completely folded in half and standing straight up on the frame. He ran out of the apartment after that and came back later to find everything back to normal. No other experiences after that one. This goes back a couple of years. It was the summer of my sophomore year in high school, and I was working at a local pizza joint and had gotten off early. I called my buddy up and we made plans to go over to our other buddy's farm after he was off of work. We got there early and let ourselves in the pasture and went around shit some arrows until we got bored. We then decided that we would go for a walk down the road until we reached the private property sign and the road turned to gravel. We kept walking about a quarter mile until we saw some fresh tire tracks that went into some deep bushes. We followed the tire tracks and saw a cream 1990s Toyota 4Runner deep in the brush. I approached from the right and my friend approached from the left. As I got closer, I saw what looked like someone had wiped something off on the passenger side of the windshield. We parked inside and the back seats were down and there was a sheet draped over a figure. We looked at each other and ran back to the farm where we either had to make a decision on if we were going to call the cops or just let it slide. Being on private property, we were afraid to get in trouble ourselves. We decided to wait for our friend to get back to his farm and we would take him up there and see for himself. After a second trip up there, all three of us realized that this car was not meant to be here and something was in the back. We went back to the farm as it was getting dark and decided we had to let an adult know. So we went to his neighbor, who is a retired Air Force pilot. He grabbed his gun and his truck with floodlights and instructed us to show him where we found the car. We drove up past the private property sign and up the gravel road and parked the truck so we could see the hidden car. We all hopped out and he turned the floodlights on. Right as the lights went on, two men ran out from the back of the car and hopped in, put it in drive and accelerated out of there, skidding past as we down and out of the way. We ended up getting the license plate and contacting the police, but it turns out the car was registered to a missing person who still hadn't been found. After years of telling the story, someone pointed out the scariest thing about it that as a kid I had never realized. Those two men who drove off in that car had probably been watching us the whole time and had every chance to do whatever they wanted to. I just remembered this story from a former roommate. Happened after he found new shared living accommodations with an elderly 60-plus-year-old gentleman that mostly kept to himself. My roommate traveled a lot for work and also met a girl who worked overseas, so he was in and out of that house days at a time visiting his girlfriend. He barely saw the house owner a lot and got accustomed to it. One day after returning from a 2-week trip, he returned home and didn't find his older roommate. No worries, he was exhausted and slept in most of the weekend. Next week, still no sign of his roommate. Also, the house was starting to get a weird, funky smell and an overall eerie atmosphere. By now, you should know where this is heading at. It took a few more days before the owner's body was found. It was in his locked bedroom, as he had died of a heart attack in his sleep sometime during the 2 weeks my friend was gone, and the discovery itself was pretty gross out. The old man had no other family members, and so former roommate had to move soon. He was creeped out by the whole experience and fell into hard times for being suddenly homeless. Couch surfed for a while before finally moving in with his girlfriend overseas. Recently, in German newspaper, a 15-year-old boy not too far away from where I live was missing for a year. Left the house in the afternoon, did not come back. A few weeks ago, a farmer went to pick up some old silo bales from a field right next to the missing boy's home. He found the body stuck head down between the bales, as if trying to pick up the mobile phone that had fallen between them. What a scary way to die, when you're young and want to do nothing but sit on some bales and chit-chat with friends on your mobile phone.